Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And this week, the ITPro Podcast is once again returning to space.
Earlier this year, we spoke to FreeSat CTO Peter Simpson about the technological challenges of running a satellite TV network. But this week, we're taking a broader look at the world of space exploration and how the technology used to boldly go can end up helping us back here on Earth.
I love space. I'm so glad that we're doing this podcast because I love space. One of my earliest articles for ITPro was about how 3D printing might be used to build a moon base for like permanent settlement on the moon. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, I know. We'll
That's
dig
a
it out.
super interesting idea.
I know. We'll dig it out and put it in the show notes. So yes, I'm very on board for this particular edition of the ITPro podcast.
And I think it's timely as well because just recently we've had some of what I think is the most mind-blowing advancements in space exploration really ever. You know, we've put oxygen on Mars and flown a helicopter on the surface of Mars, both
remotely.
of which are unbelievably cool. Yes, remotely, I should stress. There hasn't been a secret manned Mars mission that nobody knew about.
Indeed.
But to tell us more about the technological advancements that have helped get us here, we're joined this week by Paul Kostek, Advisory Systems Engineer with Base2 Solutions and Senior Member of the IEEE. Paul, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. So you raise a very interesting topic, and I think Jane raised an interesting question about the 3D printing on the moon. I mean, that has been an area that people want to explore because one of the big challenges, obviously, when you talk about missions to Mars and extended stays is how are you going to bring all that stuff with you? If you watch the movie The Martian, you know, there was a whole discussion on we pre-shipped materials and those things are being considered, but people are looking at, can we take 3D printing to another level? And it also falls back into then, can we take that 3D printing that's being done to create facilities on the moon, Mars? Can we reuse that on the Earth? Can we create the ability to quickly print out and assemble housing for the homeless in developing areas and areas that have been hit by natural disasters? I think that's just one example of a case where you're taking a technology that started on Earth, is expanding its use in space, but then bringing it back. If you go back to the beginning of the in the 1960s in the space race, and that's basically the reason I became an engineer. I was a 12-year-old kid when the U.S. landed on the moon. We look at the technologies that were used then, the computing systems that were used to land the lunar module and fly the Apollo spacecraft to and back from the Earth. All of those developments paid for by NASA would have never been done in a commercial market. People would have looked at that and said, that's insane to try to shrink the size of these computers. As a result of the success of those missions and the capability that was developed, what ended up happening, of course, was we now see smartphones, we see laptop computers, all of the computing changed on what was put on the avionics systems for airplanes. So there's been a natural to and fro over the years in space exploration where things that are done in space are almost a demonstrator project at times for what we can possibly do here on Earth.
So you say you started to become interested once man landed on the moon back in the 60s. How long have you actually been working in the space industry?
So I've been in the space industry. I do consulting, so of course I'm in and out of the space industry for the last 15 years. I also spend part of my time doing medical device development, which kind of, again, is another one of those outflows of the space world where materials developed for space are then reused in other areas, including the medical side. And of course, the International Space Station has been used for many experiments of what kind of effect long-term exposure to gravity or lack of gravity has for people. Those same types of treatments are then used on Earth to look at people and say, especially when astronauts return after extended stays, people are now looking at what are the impacts on their body, and are there ways to treat that then we can use to treat other ways for people who are having illnesses or other problems.
So we've spoken already about some of the some of the technological advancements that have been gifted to us by the space race and by space exploration in general. But there's been really a surprising amount over the years. So, some of the more obvious examples that people may know are things like space blankets. So those reflective kind of blankets that you often see marathon runners and the like wrapped in. They're originally a byproduct of space exploration. So is LASIK for medical procedures and eye surgery, memory foam, cordless vacuums, freeze dried foods, baby foods, and even OpenStack is originally a product of NASA.
That's a new one on me, OpenStack. I had no idea.
Well, I think, again, what drives a lot of innovation when you talk about space is you're going into a hostile environment, you're going into it with a product or a system that cannot fail. Reliability has to be such that leaving and coming back is not, not coming back is not an option. So as a consequence, the work that's done on the vehicles, on the suits, on the means of feeding people, getting them water, oxygen, become much more mission critical. And so after that initial outlay of funding is done, then it's the opportunity to look back after and say, how can we use this on Earth? Is there more effective ways to use sensor technologies to determine what the air is like in a building? I mean, obviously that's a much more sensitive issue today in the era of COVID. Of do we have the proper airflow? Do we have filters that are actually cleaning the air and making it safe? So that's kind of the types of things that
Mm.
typically, in a lot of cases, if we sit here today and say what will be the technologies that will come back from missions to Mars, we probably can't say exactly right now, because once we actually make the step of putting people on Mars and safely returning them, then you'll see people who will be looking at some of these things and saying, hey, we can apply this here on Earth. Or, if you think about unmanned vehicles, classic example where traditionally miners went in underground to do the mining. Well, then people figured out, why are we sending people in with all the risk? Let's invest in technology to send unmanned vehicles to do a lot of the digging and removing of the material for the mining operations. Uh, wouldn't have been something many people would have thought about. They would have thought that was a crazy idea. But as unmanned technologies evolved, you saw the opportunities to do those things. So a lot of cases, what'll happen is people will suddenly look at something and go, I can use this.
And I suppose a lot of it is sort of the opportunity or the situation presenting itself, like you mentioned just now, sort of, filtering air or monitoring air quality in the way that it's monitored in space is kind of prior to the beginning of 2020. You'd probably think that that is not something that we'd need down here on Earth, and we're fine with just the air that's going around. But the opportunity or the circumstance has presented itself now that actually that technology would be quite helpful back here on dry land.
Absolutely. And I laugh and think about things now. You hear people talking about HEPA filters that are in airplanes or in buildings. I'm sure for the average person 2 years ago, if you would have said HEPA filter, they would have said, I don't know and I don't care. But now people are like, the airplanes have HEPA filters, please, or do the hospitals have HEPA filters? So I think people immediately respond to how a technology is used, and it goes from, I think the smartphone is probably the classic model of something that 12 years ago everyone said, who's going to want that, to today, if a person misplaces their smartphone, it isn't like misplacing a child or another part of your body. I mean, people get very upset. And so I think technology, we go through these periods where people go, I can't see it, never happened. Even electric cars. I mean, I think people were like, electric cars, no, that's a dumb idea. Now more and more people are adopting it. I think we're in that transitional period where now governments are looking like, how do we put the infrastructure in so that somebody can make a cross country trip, whether it's in the UK or the US, and not have to worry about suddenly not having enough charge in their car. Again, those types of changes, and again, it's the battery technology. A lot of the lithium ion work was done in space and aerospace industries, and it's now transitioning to the automobile. Transition to your phone. Now it's transitioning to the automobile, and people are looking for the next generation of batteries that are safer, more reliable. And again, just kind of that natural segue that takes place. The challenge I think is always the front end costs are so large. For commercial products, they're not going to typically be taken. But I think when you start looking at people undertaking space operations, and if you look at space today, one of the great interesting things about it is, and I think a lot of people using the word democratization of space, that you see not just the traditional space powers, the United States, Russia, you have China, you have India, you had the United Arab Emirates putting a satellite in orbit around Mars just about the time when the U.S. was landing its latest probes, its rover and its helicopter. So there's a lot of fascinating things going on, and I think what we're seeing is greater growth in the STEM market, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that's encouraging people to look at space as a means to attract people. Almost the same thing when I was a kid saying, this space stuff is cool. I want to be involved in this industry and go into engineering. I think we're seeing a new generation outside of the traditional countries saying, hey, we can do this space stuff today because prices have gone down. You've got companies that are using 3D printers to create rockets, which drops the cost. You've got all of these
Mm.
nano satellites, CubeSats that are out there. These constellations that are being created for communications, that where people are somewhat going, what's the big deal? You're now bringing the internet connectivity to people in rural and undeveloped countries where the whole infrastructure would be hard to put in, but it's much easier to do with a satellite network with small satellites that are inexpensive.
Yeah, it's quite something sort of nowadays to sit and watch crews take off with SpaceX and looking very futuristic, and you're going up and down in the same rockets, and maybe not quite how it was in the 60s, but there's some element of that when you're watching it. And like you said, when we think about the space race, you've named a number of other countries, and when countries are involved, obviously the motivation is different. The space race, it was
Right.
all Cold War technology. Now it's kind of not Cold War, but it's kind of more military type stuff and building capabilities at a national level. But this appearance of companies that are commercial entities is quite new. What kind of influence is that having on, I guess, space in general, or space exploration in general, and also the kind of technologies that we are then having filter back down to us?
Right. Well, I think the big difference, of course, for everyone, the commercial enterprises are taking a very different approach. I mean, initially they were all playing around with the space tourism idea. There are still a lot of people who put out some initial down payments on travel that may get to travel this year, finally, after 7, 8 years. Um, but I think the difference is it's less of a political ploy. I mean, think about it. The 60s was a race between two ideologies, right? Is it the free West versus the Soviet system? Today, we're into a mode where people are looking at space. And I always send people, especially younger people who haven't looked at 2001: A Space Odyssey, I always tell them, go and look at the beginning of that movie, and you'll see things like, granted, it's long gone airline, Pan Am, but you'll see a spacecraft branded Pan Am flying up to a space station that has a Hilton hotel in it. And I said, that was the vision people had 20 years ago. That's what space was going to be. And it's taken us 20 years to get here. But now we're seeing companies talking about, we're going to build our own space station that's going to be like a hotel, and people will be able to go up for a week or 2 week stays. You now have a commercial enterprise saying, you want to go to the space station or some other venue, we'll take you there. Obviously, and I think it's an ongoing discussion of what's going to happen as commercial enterprises start to land on planets like the moon or land on Mars. How do you manage that? I equate it to, if you're looking at an Earth, everyone has agreed on the Antarctic, that the Antarctic is kind of a research center. Nobody owns it. Everybody has platforms there to do research. Are we going to be able to work the same way when we talk about leaving Earth? Or are we going to be saying, this is my area, you don't get to come into it? And it won't be a country's flag, it'll be a company's flag saying, we now possess this land or this area for tourism, maybe manufacturing, or maybe deeper space. I think the impact it's had, at least in the US for NASA, is they've now moved more to a research mode and really focused on research versus now worrying about creating the rockets and other things to move people. They've kind of outsourced that to others, saying, you can do it better, commercial enterprise. We'll just buy time from you, services from you to do these things. In terms of what's going to come back from that, I would expect some of these commercial companies to look at ways to apply means of transportation. I think there's been some discussions of, could we take these rockets that are sending satellites up or people up to the ISS, could we turn that into a quick 30-minute flight from Los Angeles to Shanghai? And then you could do a one-day trip to Shanghai versus multiple days and 12 hours of travel. So you may see some people trying to apply space travel. Instead of putting somebody in orbit, they'll be like, it'll just be a quick flight from one city to another. So that may shorten up, again, the travel aspects. And I think those are the types of things that people are going to be exploring. And I think some of the companies that'll be obviously exploring, how do we put our presence on space? How do we put our presence in other places? Branding's everywhere, right? I would expect to see more branding taking place, and people trying to say, if you can't go to the moon, we can give you a similar experience here on Earth, whatever it might be. But I also figure at some point, just as happened in commercial aviation, pricing will begin to decline as time goes by. And a trip to space or a trip to the moon may become a much more affordable type of opportunity for people.
So looking at companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX, who are starting to explore kind of commercial space exploration, what's in it for them? Because, space exploration is a fairly limited market. It's a fairly niche industry, right? What's the motivation for these companies?
I think if you really look at what's going on with some of these companies, there are some folks who believe the Earth is doomed or will not be in very good shape one day, and people need to start to transit to other places. I think it's also probably no different than what we saw 400 years ago when explorers first went out as commercial enterprises to go find golden cities or wealth in India or wherever it might have been. And I think it's the same type of thing, that people are saying, what kind of opportunities could there be on another planet? Could we create cities there that we would then control? Is there some sort of materials there, though the cost of bringing them back to the Earth might not make sense, but it may make sense to say we want to do deeper exploration, and what we need to do is set up commercial enterprises on the moon or on Mars that allows us to go deeper into the universe to explore. So I think that's kind of the things that people are looking at. And I think it's also just tied in with this whole enterprise concept of saying, why can't we have a Disneyland on Mars? We've got Euro Disney. We'll have Disneyland on Mars, and people will fly there. We'll provide the service to get people there. There'll be hotel chains providing other services. Sounds somewhat crazy when you say it, but probably somewhere.
Well, it won't be the happiest place on Earth anymore.
Well, it would have to be changed, but I think people, may be looking at those from a commercial aspect of saying the exploration aspect. It's really the commercialization of how do we make Mars or the moon or other planets into places people want to go, either for short stays or long stays.
So let's look at some of the technology that's being used in space exploration currently from, I guess, more traditional tech companies rather than space companies. For example, we have covered HPE's spaceborne computer twice, if you're familiar with that particular project where they're sending servers to initially the ISS and then they're planning on sending it to Mars. So what level of activity is there from tech companies in the space industry?
Well, it's an expanding marketplace. I think one of the big ones we're seeing is the cloud companies are all realizing, especially with the advent of all of these satellite constellations going up, that there's going to be a tremendous amount of data coming down, and having the ability to have ground stations to receive this data and having people to do the analysis of this data will be critical. One of the selling points isn't just the internet connectivity and communications that people are talking about for these constellations, but it's also the ability to do climate change monitoring. I think Brazil just launched their first satellite. One of those great, interesting combinations you would never thought of. The Indians built the rocket to launch the Brazilians' first environmental satellite to monitor what's going on in the Amazon. And I think we'll see more and more of that, where companies are coming in saying there's obviously a marketplace for this. I think we've kind of gone through these phases when they were government, I'll call it funded and supported, where people thought, all right, this is great, but the politics, especially in the U.S., is one administration from another may totally undo what the previous administration did. Now commercial enterprises are looking out saying, it looks like this is going to be longer term. Even if the administration changes, some of these commercial companies are going to continue on the work they're doing, whether it's tourism, whether it's building these constellations. So there's opportunities for us on the ground, we'll say, as suppliers of services, whether it's providing the ground stations, whether it's data analysis, data distribution. So I think that's the reason you're seeing tech companies jump into it. They really see space for the first time as a viable option. And I think the successes of the last few years of actual commercial enterprises successfully launching rockets, getting them to the ISS, returning, and now taking people, have moved us from it'll never happen to I wonder if it could happen to wow, this is really happening. And I think you've got a flight coming up soon that'll have 4 non-traditional astronauts, I'll call them, on there. Non-professionals, I guess, is what they're calling it. That changes things, right? Now suddenly it isn't just occasional billionaire spending $50 million to fly up on a Russian rocket to the space station. These are now people who are kind of average people who are going on a 3-day trip around the earth. So those types of things will also start to attract other companies to figure out, how do we play in this same marketplace?
So we've spoken a fair amount about some of the newer satellite constellations and the increasing amount of satellite technology that's being used by both companies and kind of national governments and agencies and whatnot. But one of the kind of increasing concerns that's being voiced around this is the idea of space pollution, effectively, and the fact that they're kind of many people think that there isn't really a satisfactory method for getting these satellites back out of the atmosphere when they stop being useful. Is this increasing activity kind of running the risk that we're just going to stop accumulating this layer of space junk in the upper atmosphere?
Well, I think it's even beyond the space junk. There are people concerned, astronomers have expressed a lot of concern that because these constellations are in low Earth orbit, they're losing some of their visibility because of all these satellites that are up there now. And we're talking, we've gone from thousands of satellites being around the Earth to now people talking about launching, tens of thousands of these small satellites, and building these things. So there's a
Mm.
couple of issues that come up. One is obviously the question of space debris. When these satellites die, are they going to be set up correctly to drop into orbit and burn up? But you also just have the problem of traffic control. I'll use that description of it. It's really an air traffic management issue of you have so many satellites floating around up there. Can you effectively keep them away from others? And you have the question of these low cost satellites that are used typically in these constellations versus these very expensive, very large satellites that are used for things such as GPS and communications. You don't want these colliding, and there have been a few cases, and so there's still a need for an ongoing discussion of how do you manage what's going on around the Earth. There really is no body right now that makes the decision that says you can launch, you can't launch. Each country controls it, but there is no overall arching body that's saying, how are we going to keep this under control? When you look at satellite constellations that right now are being planned, there's several in the US, Canada, the UK. So I think people are starting to get concerned. And of course, it's the old, if you've ever watched the movie Gravity, everybody looks at that and thinks, could that really happen? And, the answer is yes. I mean, there could obviously be a huge issue like that. And the question's always going to be, who's going to take that charge, especially when you have commercial enterprises launching, when you have new players from different countries coming in to launch. It's going to be a real challenge to get that done. And is anybody going to be willing to step up and say, let's all get together and talk about how we're going to do this?
And in fact, as we record this, there is currently a Chinese rocket which is currently in a deteriorating orbit, which is predicted to potentially survive re-entry and crash land at a completely unknown point on the Earth, which is kind of causing some measure of concern.
Absolutely nobody should be concerned about that, purely because this happened once before and China just gets out a big missile and shoots it down.
Well, that's okay then. I feel much better.
The problem is solved. Then you just have lots of small bits of junk.
Missiles, solution to every problem.
Yes, I think there's been a lot of people discussing that. There was actually not far from in Washington State where I live, there was actually some hardware that came down from a satellite that ended up not totally destroying itself. And what was ironic was, of course, the farmer who had it landed on his farmland didn't realize what it was. And he was really annoyed when all these people showed up looking for what the pieces were. There are incredibly space junk collectors who run around the country trying to find out where satellites or other space debris has landed to collect it. So he was pretty upset that he had all these people running around looking for this equipment. And again, it's going to become a big concern. I mean, right now, people have been incredibly lucky that there has not been a real accident or incident or death or serious injuries. But it'll obviously become a real issue if something like that were to take place.
Looking at this kind of commercial question, then, what role can the private sector and, tech companies in particular, these companies who are starting to get more and more into the space exploration field, is there anything that these organizations can do to help address or alleviate some of these problems before they become critical?
Well, I think it almost becomes a necessity of actually having the discussion, of getting groups together to say, how are we going to manage all of these satellite constellations? Some people may even ask the question, do you need them all? It's going to become this huge pricing issue, right? Of how much is it going to cost me to get internet from constellation A versus B versus C? It'll almost become like the cell phone competitions of, why would you buy from them? You can buy from us unless my satellites go down. I think the commercial enterprises, if nothing else, we probably need to bring in everyone's favorite group, the lawyers, into this discussion of how do you manage liability in space? What is the liability in space? Two parties from two different countries. One may be a military satellite, one could be a commercial one. How does all of that going to play out? So it's almost a necessity. Maybe the insurance companies are the guys, not the tech companies, but the insurance companies who have to ask the question of how are we going to manage all of these things that are flying around, and how are we going to deal with the first time a returning space vehicle maybe hits a commercial airplane, or vice versa. There's that potential of that taking place, even though right now areas are shut down. If they become as ubiquitous as everybody thinks, we'll have all these planes flying, space vehicles going off for tourism every day, multiple days a week. What's the possibility of an accident taking place between a space vehicle and a commercial airliner or a private plane someone's flying? So some of these issues are not necessarily for the tech companies to solve. They're going to end up being for other folks to solve and ask the question of how do you manage this area? How do you manage space? How do you manage what's going on? I think the same issues are going to come up with the return to the moon. The same issue is going to come up potentially with Mars. Is someone going to be able to claim it for a country or a company and say this segment's mine and nobody else can come here? There are treaties floating around that were done in the 60s when people really thought this was going to happen, and we'd have, it's the old joke, where's my rocket pack and where's my, house on the moon? People thought those things were going to take place quickly. We may get to that point, and I think the question then becomes, the companies have to be involved and have a say, but I think it really turns into a bigger question of how do we, as general citizens of Earth, as we move to other venues, how do we want to manage that? How is all of that going to come into play? And I'm not sure the tech companies can manage it on their own. They need to be a player because obviously it impacts them. And obviously, since the rules right now are limited, they can continue on doing business pretty much any way they want. And so that's going to be, I think, a huge challenge for everyone to figure out how does all of this play together. The unfortunate aspect usually is nothing ever gets done until a disaster takes place. Whether it's the sinking of the Titanic or any other type of thing that suddenly people go, wow, we got to really get this under control. So I think this is one of those great question areas that are sitting there right now. There's some battles even in the US right now about frequency ranges that the constellations can use, and who's first and who gets access to those and who gets the other frequencies, and everyone's still trying to work those things out. And I think sometimes the biggest challenge for the bureaucracies that run these things is their folks are not necessarily technically up to the same levels that the folks who are building these things in corporations are. So it's a real challenge for them too to figure out how to actually make all of these things work in a fair way.
So, Paul, we spoke a bit about, air filters and stuff. That might be something that is soon coming to us from space to, your office or whatever. What other innovations might space exploration give us, the general populace in the near future?
Well, I think things like battery technology, which is one of the critical areas for a lot of things we're doing, obviously on Earth, whether it's for transportation, for UAVs, is a big area in play in space. Materials is always one of the big ones because people who are experimenting with 3D printers to build a rocket ship are now, you look at that experience and you can take that and bring that to the Earth and say, can we 3D print other things that people need here on Earth, whether it's shelter or even simple vehicles? So I think those will be some of the areas we'll be seeing coming along. The computing has gone about as far as it's going to go for, I don't think there's any huge innovations coming out of there, but I think data management will be a huge one. And that doesn't sound like a real sexy thing, but when you think about the amount of data that is generated on the Earth right now, one of the biggest challenges is how do we manage it all and how do we use it all? And I think the folks who are now working in space are trying to address that particular challenge. And I think that can actually be one of the critical ones for folks here on Earth in terms of just the ability to manage the huge amounts of data we have and use it effectively to improve people's lives.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week, but our thanks once again to Paul Kostek for joining us.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast, and if you can, leave us a rating and a review, as it really does help new listeners find the show.
We'll be back next week with more analysis from the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.